Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Jonathan Erasmus. I'm your host for the evening. I'm a project manager at the Community Action Network, an initiative of CAN. Excuse me. Throughout the year, the Community Action Network has hosted a series of webinars focusing on empowering communities to make better decisions that impact their neighborhoods, from providing security solutions to dealing with land invasions, understanding municipal budgets, considering boycotting rates, which was obviously a contentious issue, confusion over property valuations, and how to deal with development planning. These are issues that communities throughout South Africa must confront and deal with on a regular basis. This is our final webinar for the year, and quite a journey it has been. And in this webinar, we will discuss that for these fights to be meaningful, democracy must not only be practiced, but it must also be protected, particularly at local government level. And to help us have this discussion, tonight we have Professor William Gomede, a staunch advocate of democracy and really a calming voice in the noise, along with outer local government executive Julius Kleins, who's been involved in the local government space for many years. And both of them aim to unpack why democracy needs to be entrenched and why community voices matter more than ever before in South Africa, as we enter what is really a new political landscape. If you have any questions for our guests, please make use of the chat on the Zoom, and we will deal with the Q&A at the end of the session in the last 15 minutes or so. And finally, please also take the opportunity to introduce yourself on the chat, letting us know where you're from in the country and any other kind of tidbits that you may want to drop from time to time. So without kind of taking any longer, our first panelist we're going to introduce is obviously William Gomede. He is an associate professor at the School of Governance at the University of Witwatersrand. He is also the founder and chair of the Democracy Works Foundation, and he comes from a history of journalism and media. And I gather he was the deputy editor of the Sowetan newspaper many years ago. Professor, when I look at South Africa from an objective perspective, there are, in my view, two South Africas. I'm not referring to the economy, this we know, but from a standpoint of practicing democracy. On a national, and provincial front, we practice democracy every 5 years, and for the most part, we are spectators to the palace intrigue. But at a local level, democracy is practiced daily, and in many ways, local government is where democracy comes alive and has the most scope for growth and development. What do you think about the above statement of those two kind of South African democracies? And secondly, if South Africa was a patient and you were a medical doctor, what diagnosis would you give South Africa on the state of democracy?
Good evening, and thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here. Just the first thing just to say, that democracy really is the best system as a form of governance. And I know, sadly, in South Africa, there are a lot of people who don't believe in democracy, a lot of people who think democracy is too noisy, or democracy is chaotic, and so on. But a long history since the Second World War, if you look at Africa, for example, the countries that have done very well, those are the countries that pursue democracy. And even if you look outside South Africa or outside Africa, even in developing countries, democracy is the one system that consistently delivers growth, peace, and it also stability of countries. Now let's look, if one have to make a diagnosis of where we are in South Africa, the state of democracy, I think that, often people forget that in order to get a quality democracy, what needs to do, we need to build or foster a culture, a democratic culture. And so what South Africa has, we have the laws, we have the institutions. So we've got the instrumental things about democracy. But what is missing right now is the culture of democracy. And the culture of democracy actually is what brings us to a quality democracy. Now, let me just what is a culture of democracy? The culture of democracy is, the very, very basic one where people accept that democracy is the only game in town, and so on. And unfortunately, not everyone in South Africa, I mean, there's some political parties that are against the constitution, don't believe in democracy. And also, unfortunately, in our country, we have competing systems to democracy. What do I mean by competing systems? You know, in some traditional areas, there's traditional law, and that is anti-democracy. And in some places, if you're in a township on the Cape Flats or in Soweto or parts of Durban, and there are gangs, so, you know, gang governance, and so on. And we have for many, many years, when the ANC was the dominant governing party, its culture became the country's culture. The ANC's culture, unfortunately, has not been democratic. So the ANC's culture because the ANC almost became a party state where the ANC deployed its cadres to government and to institutions, which means the ANC became the government. And the ANC's culture became above the democratic culture. Almost if you go back and, you know, Jacob Zuma, when he used to be the ANC president, South African president, he said to ANC members of parliament that they have to listen to the ANC first before the constitution and before the democracy. Now, obviously, that is absolutely wrong. And so that is almost where the ANC's culture had become a competing system to our democracy. And the same also, for example, economic freedom fighters and now MK, you know, these populist parties, they have their own culture, and many times their cultures are often against democracy, although they use the, you know, democratic institutions often when they want to go to court and so on. But at other times, you know, they reject our democracy and democratic institutions.
Yeah, thank you. And I quite like the idea of the kind of the culture of democracy. And I think you've hit the nail on the head about how the ANC's culture became our culture and how it manifests itself at specifically at a local level. The lack of accountability, the lack of transparency, the lack of top-down kind of order and control, which is very much a kind of, I'd say, part of what the ANC is. So, and using that, I want to take a deeper look at democracy at local government level. So we have the Municipal Finance Management Act, for instance. We have the Municipal Systems Act. We have the Municipal Structures Act. We've got a host of other legislation that specifically speaks to local government. Of course, and then there's a whole lot of legislation that mentions the passing. And an objective reading of most of these documents is that they are fair documents. They obviously might be some issues that we take up with them, but in generally they're fair, they're logical, they make sense. And all of them dictate the need for a high level of accountability, transparency, and public participation. Yet, like here in the city of Johannesburg, where I am at the moment, the economic heartbeat of the nation, and in fact, where you are today as well, Pietermaritzburg, capital of KwaZulu-Natal, clearly these acts are failing us. One just has to take a walk outside and one can see it. Sure, people, not acts, are what govern, but how do we fix democracy at a local government level where governance is clearly the Achilles heel? What is the next step, do you think, we need to make as a country?
I mean, at a local level is actually where democracy is exercised on a daily basis. But our local democracy sadly has been the weakest link in our bigger democracy, because that's where things have failed. I mean, we know Johannesburg has become a failed city. And I think we just have to name it. It's become a failed city. Now, it starts at a couple of levels. The first level is just in terms of voting as a core part of a democracy and holding elected officials accountable. Now, sadly, what we've seen up to now is that people do not use their right consciously. So in countries like South Africa, without that divided past, democracy often fail, and we often struggle to get a democratic culture, whether it's at the national level or at the local level, because people vote for parties and individuals not based on their performance, but based on things like color, based on the past, and people don't vote in the present. Now, the moment when people start to vote in the present, then democracy becomes much more qualitative. That's the first thing. The second thing is in terms of, people don't avail themselves. At a local level, it is very important to get quality people to avail themselves to stand in election. And then the third one is for locals, if you're a resident, come out and actually vote. And that's important because we always have very, very low voting turnouts. And then fourthly, what needs to be done is for local citizens to participate at all levels at a local level, starting from school boards at a local level to, the committees, the ward committees, and so on. So actively participate. And then there's a civil society aspect of it. Now, sometimes when the local state fail, where citizens actually can do alternative delivery at that local level.
And I think the line that you used, failed states or failed kind of municipality, and I am going to bring in Julia Fish in a little bit later, just to really tell the listeners of what this issue is and how failed it is, and she's dealing with it on a daily basis. But before we go there, I'd just like to bring in Julius Kleins. Julius leads, obviously, OUTS's local government department and has extensive experience in governance, community advocacy, water, and environmental management. Julius, let me pose the same question to you. How do we fix democracy at a local level where governance, is clearly the Achilles heel?
Thanks, Jonathan. And I totally agree with what Professor Gomede is saying. It's about the culture that we need to foster in our communities. And that is really where the shareholdership lies within a municipality. And I don't think people really realize that. We've grown into a culture where we believe we're paying for a service and we're expecting it in return. That's great in a capitalist economy because there's competition. If you don't get a proper service, you just go to the next one with the cheapest, best service or ratings these days. It doesn't work like that in local government. Dr. Nerif Biljon from the University of the Free State also recently publicized a very interesting research paper that speaks about the different communities throughout the world and where municipalities thrive. And they're talking about three different segments. The first one is you pay and you expect. Now, evidently, and this is very interesting, this is where the worst performing municipalities are. Now, secondly, is where communities have a say in their municipalities and they've got some extended oversight, and the municipality still provides a service, but the shareholders have some influence. And they're doing okay. But the most successful municipalities and communities in the world, according to this research, is where they call it the concept of co-creation or co-governance, as we call it at OUTA, where there's organized citizenry where they are part of the solution. They take ownership of their communities. So they don't necessarily just vote for whoever political party puts in front of them. In fact, these communities have professionalized this kind of co-governance by mostly having people with project management ability and an understanding of what the needs in that community are, infrastructure related, don't get me wrong. And I think this is where a lot of the issues come in municipalities, is because we've got a democratic voice, but we don't necessarily grasp the mandate of a municipality, which is to provide basic services. From a political point of view, if you demand specific things from your political leaders, all of a sudden you're starting to see that budgets in municipalities are allocated to things that are non-essential services and not necessarily even in a municipality's mandate. So I think we need to foster a more mature culture of active citizenry and still working within the framework of the law. Jonathan, you mentioned earlier that the legislation's failed us to an extent. Yeah, I think our legislation is pretty good. I think it's really the governance part, the people that you spoke about, that's been failing us. And when it comes to a municipality and we look at the structure, you've got the political structure and the administrative structure. Now, the administration is obviously officials having to do the job. We need to start looking at how can we shape the future, not necessarily change the law, but shape the future of governance. And I think, as Professor Gomede rightfully said, is these very leaders that you and I know. We know where they stay. We know that they serve us, whether it's on the school governing body or whether it is at the local church. We know who these credible individuals are. And I think that's where we need to start looking at using the legislation differently, but getting proper leaders and mature leaders to have oversight and hopefully foster better democratic participation. I recently book, and I just want to close it off there. I just finished a book called Becoming an Adult, and it's very interesting. Very interesting read. But what I take from it is we are still a young democracy, even though it's 30 years old. But in this book, it says, you become an adult, but sometimes these adults still rely on their parents, and you don't realize that you are an equal. And, if we start taking up that responsibility in a democracy and we start acting maturely and participating with understanding and being informed, I think we'll have a lot more influence. And then you can start seeing the alternatives that Professor Gomede spoke about, where you can start utilizing even local resources, the specialized skills within a community to become part of the solution instead of relying on a centralized local government structure. So I think that's very important. And lastly, voting is once every 1,800 days. It's something like that over 5 years. The other 1,800 days, we are customers, but we also need to understand that we are shareholders. So we need to have a say and oversight on how municipalities perform and how our money is being spent in the future.
Thanks, Julius. In fact, I'm going to use your phrase of being adults, and I'm going to ask Julia to ask her this question. Is Johannesburg, the city of Johannesburg, behaving like an adult? And if you had to view the city as a person, perhaps you could just give us a little rundown. And I think it's important because it really adds context to this discussion about failure of acts and failure, well, not failure of acts, but failure of people. So yes, Julia, maybe you could just assist us with that. Thanks.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, as you said, I am the regional manager of the Outer Initiative Joburg Can. I live in an area of Johannesburg called Melville, and as this moment, I haven't had water in 2 weeks. So that's the kind of service delivery that we're getting on a local level in the city. And today, council sat, they have their monthly meetings, and I attend every one of these meetings, and quite frankly, they are embarrassing for the people of the city. What happens in these meetings is rarely actually people behaving like adults. They get into spats, they get into political to's and fro's, and nothing really happens that benefits the residents of the city. So the mayor today in his address to council said, oh, keep reporting when you don't have water. We're doing something about the valves. But that's really a slap in the face for people who are struggling with their day-to-day life. So as you mentioned earlier, local government is where people engage with democracy on a regular basis. And instead, what we're seeing is people are having to engage aggressively because they're being treated like children by people behaving like children. So instead of actually dealing with people being upset and going, yes, you have a right to water, you have a right to electricity, they're going, you're the problem. And in a lot of cases where they're telling people to conserve water that they don't have, they get upset. And the only way that they seem to engage and listen to their customers and their voter base is through, sparkly little toys and, here's a swimming pool here that you can't fill because there's no water. Here's a rec center or other things that are easy vote getters, but they're not the core mandate of how a city is supposed to operate. The core function is to provide services, to collect that revenue, to pay for those services, to actually do the maintenance on those elements. So that's your traffic lights, that's your roads, that's your water infrastructure, and ensuring that you are effectively being billed for what you're receiving from your municipality. And instead, what we're seeing is people with extended budgets that are spending them on perks and people. The bloated civil service, I think, is one of the biggest issues. And when people don't see accountability for that irregular spending, that's where the anger comes in. When we're not actually then using the mechanisms that you mentioned, like the Municipal Finance Act, to actually go, this is not an acceptable level of service. This is not an acceptable level of production from what we want from our municipalities. Then we start seeing really disgruntled residents. And we saw that today in Westbury, where instead of actually listening to people who are upset that they don't have water, they send in the police. And when you're having to mediate with people who are just trying to get their basic services delivered through heavy-handed tactics, then we've actually regressed in our democracy rather than advanced where we were 30 years ago.
Yeah, Julia, and I'm just going to ask you, I think one of the things that you deal with on a regular basis is the issue of public participation. I think it's what you just said about Westbury is an indication that this is not something that's practiced particularly well in COJ. Just give our listeners what are the issues with public participation in arguably the best resourced city in the country with the largest budget, the biggest economy, with all the means, the human capital, the intellectual capital, everything sits here. And perhaps just give us an unpacking of how this public participation is simply not happening.
Well, we see that specifically in how some of the laws are being passed and some of these bylaws are being enacted. With the annual IDP process, which is the Integrated Development Plan, which lays out what the city will be doing and where they are in terms of building infrastructure and maintaining services. We saw the implementation of the 230 Rand prepaid service charge. Yes, there is a need, like I said, to maintain the services of the city, which includes securing the network that provides us with electricity. And in terms of postpaid customers, they're paying exorbitant amounts when it comes to network charges. We need to have a look at how we balance a cost of service, and instead of passing down the cost of ineptitude and issues with losses within our systems onto customers in terms of tariffs, we're now adding those on in these erroneous additional charges. When that IDP came out and people were told that they were going to be paying the service charge, they go around the city and they do regional meetings and public participation events. And at not one of those events was this prepaid service charge properly laid out to people so they could understand what the effect was going to be. Instead, we were told, don't worry, if you're on the indigent register and you really can't afford it, which most people on prepaid are, because they're in a situation where they are trying to reduce their costs, trying to save money, trying to be responsible in terms of how much they consume, using prepaid as an element of that. What we saw instead was, if you're on the indigent register and you can't afford it, you'll be covered. But they're not covered, because also what we've discovered in Joburg Can is that only 130 households are actually on that register, whereas Treasury provides for 1.1 million households to be able to receive that grant and provide dignity and service for many people. So it's really seeing that a city doesn't listen. And when you look at these meetings and you actually attend what's happening in these public participation events, people have come there to vent because they don't have another platform to tell the city that they're unhappy. But we're also seeing people come there with, they kind of bust in from different areas. And these happen at very inconvenient times. People who are earning a living, trying to engage with the city, have work during the week. And we're seeing them, 3 o'clock in the afternoon in a dodgy rec center that doesn't have water or doesn't have electricity. The network doesn't work, so people can't participate online. It's seen as a tick box exercise. They've already decided what the elements of their bylaws and new amendments and policies are going to be. And then they just tick the box and go, we've spoken to people and no one really got upset. And you're also seeing that in other spaces like development planning, where there's these huge developments that go up without integrated planning for what that means for the services and infrastructure in an area. And instead of really listening to the objections, they get rubber stamped at a municipal planning tribunal. And that further angers people. So when they feel that they don't have a voice, these public participation processes just make it worse, because then the city can turn around and go, oh, we've done our bit. We spoke to people, that's fine. And the escalation and the mechanisms where people can then go back and appeal and tell people that they're unhappy don't exist. So, you know, we've defunded elements of the single law enforcement entity. We've defunded elements of GFAs, which are the investigative arms. We're defunding the ombudsman. All these mechanisms that are supposed to try and help people are too slow, they're inadequate. And we're seeing policies like the general valuation role, which we're quite involved with, that increases people's property rates, is really a problem, because those processes are never closed. These appeals are not coming to fruition, and people are therefore just being completely shut out of participatory democracy.
Yeah, yes, Julia, it is just some of the projects that we are doing here at ARTA and at the Community Action Network in Joburg Can is helping connect people with their municipality or with people. We try, obviously, encourage community organizations to get engaged, to take the fights head on with their municipality, not only in the negative sense, but in a proactive sense, to try to build relationships, to build, as this theme of this webinar series has been, is co-governance, to really kind of make sure we're all moving together at the same time. I'm going to bring you back, Professor Gomede, and really to talk about this issue of communities. I'm from KwaZulu-Natal, from Durban, and after the July 2021 looting, which I think we all remember quite clearly, when it erupted, if you were anywhere else in the country, it erupted on your televisions. If you're in certain parts of Gauteng, it became obviously very real. And for anyone who was in the province at that time, it was a very scary time. It was the first time that, in my living memory, where we really had to think about making a decision of, okay, what time do we get in our car and drive? And where do we drive to? It really was a boiling point. But what it did do, for all the kind of negativity that it produced, specifically on the economy and obviously housing prices and the whole bang shoot, was that there's been an explosion of organized community groups in KwaZulu-Natal. The mushrooming of residents and ratepayer associations and action groups has been phenomenal. It really has been the positive byproduct of all of this. And communities wanting to hold local government to account. So the question is, does South Africa, through its laws and regulations, make enough provision to give voice to community organizations? And in your view, what else do we need to do to improve this, at least from a macro perspective?
No, thank you for that. Our problem in the country right now, when I've spoken about culture, democratic culture, is that people often think they overemphasize the protest part of it, and they de-emphasize all of the other important things. For example, I mean, I said just in terms of, I started off with a vote. Don't vote based on the past. Don't vote because somebody has your same color or speaks like you or look like you. Vote for competence and that culture, democratic culture and quality. But I mean, I think what else we can do as active citizens is to hold individuals accountable. And we can hold them accountable through actually using the law. And I know not everyone has the resources to hold people accountable. Let's go back to Johannesburg. I mean, it is now an absolute crisis. Can citizens, for example, take the mayor to court for all of the list of laws that he and his team did not follow, and for the mayor and councillors to take personal accountability? I mean, and so on. So I think those are some of the things for people with the resources to do that, and I mean, to hold elected officials accountable. I think it's going to be very important. I mean, if there's a budget and an elected official or a councillor or a public servant actually abuse their budget, did not deliver, can't we take that individual actually to court and hold that person personally liable, because right now there is no personal liability for a public servant or for elected individual. So I think that is going to be very, very important. Unfortunately, I mean, on your question in terms of can we do more to create platforms for public participation? Sadly, a lot of our platforms for public participation has been corrupted. When I say corrupted, often even let's take award committees. These days, you know, some political parties bring their own community, you know, to these sort of spaces, and so on. So we really have to, you know, all citizens have to push back. And on the participation side, I think often, you know, the community come to participate, but then the elected officials, your mayor and those sort of officials actually ignore the suggestions by people. Maybe what we should insist as local residents, it says that there is a report back from from the council to show what did they take up from the community during the public participation process. You know, what suggestions have they taken up? And if they didn't take up any suggestions and they've just had their own suggestions, maybe again, you know, that there's a protest against that sort of thing.
It's interesting that you mentioned that kind of have the suggestions been taken up from the public participation process. It's really, it's part of the internal discussions that we've been having quite a lot here at the Community Action Network of how do we make sure those suggestions are listened to and be recorded. And in a sense, a citizen-led IDP or citizen-led budget. And to tell everyone and who's in this room quietly, we are working on projects in that direction of how do we make sure that engagement is fulfilled? How do we make sure the citizen voice is heard? And it's a really, really serious issue. And just talking about, you know, solutions and, you know, Professor, you gave us some. I'm going to ask Julius to come in again, and I think I'm going to ask him this question. It's really about taking kind of a radical perspective. And if you had the power to transform local governments as it is currently structured, what kind of ideas? And I reinforce this, Julius, and you can go as radical as you want. Wave your flag. What do you think would work in transforming local government into firstly a much more democratic space, and secondly make it much more efficient and accountable to the public?
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, well, what an opportunity. So I think, you know, firstly, if you had to have a proper free access to Wi-Fi and communication ability so that we can harness the efficient technology to actually engage citizenry, that's really important. With smart technology, you can manage, you can measure, you can plan and engage your citizenry very efficiently, and also see and identify where the biggest needs are. I've seen in the chats a lot of discussion about the political sphere, and Professor Gomede also spoke about that. A municipality has a very clear mandate. It's supposed to create the foundation with basic infrastructure and services so that businesses can actually stimulate economic growth, people can get jobs and reside there and become the clients of a municipality. So I think it's really focusing on the mandate of a municipality, the core functions, instead of an ideology. So the problem that we've seen in the cultural shift of the democracy, or the abuse of democracy by political parties, as also mentioned in the chats, it's become a career. In the past, my understanding is that these community representatives did it voluntarily. They were mostly professional people who represented their communities. And now it's become a career. So you don't have to be qualified in whatsoever. I think you just shouldn't have a criminal record against you in the last 3 years to qualify to become a councillor. And And if you look at the corporate structure, of the world, the more value you add, the higher you climb the ladder, so to that company. So your loyalty is to the company. And I think that's where the democracy has been abused from this political dynamics, where it's about what value do you add to the party and not necessarily how well you serve the communities. And so it's become a very greedy element. So because there's no ideology supposedly in a municipality, I want to be radical and say there's no real need for political representation. After all, a councillor is supposed to be understanding what projects need to take place to fulfill the core mandate of a municipality, and in their responsibilities have oversight on the budget and vote on the budget and ensure that financial practices and good governance takes place from the officials, the very people who have been employed full-time to do the job. So I see a municipality that needs to be run as a non-profit company. It needs to be run like a business, with formal structures, with professionalized executive, and even the municipal manager who needs to be highly qualified. I'd like to use the example, and you've referred to Joburg earlier. There's a municipality, with a 80 billion rand budget. Now compare the quality of the municipal manager and his background and qualifications to a listed company CEO with the same budget, and you will find that it's very different. But then again, a municipality needs a proper board. One has to apply your mind on how you structure such a board, but it needs to be experts to ensure that there's good governance that takes place, so that the funding and the projects ensures that municipality fulfills its function optimally. I think that is very important. So you will almost become more customer-centric and start competing. Like, I think a very good example is Cape Town at the moment. A lot of customers are flocking their way to this very good service provider compared to others in the country. And its future looks quite sustainable financially if you compare it with other municipalities who will be out of business soon. And I think we have to have a radical shift on that. I know viewers might think, but that's called counter democracy. I don't believe so, because shareholders have a very good say and voting rights within a company. I think what's important that we need to apply our minds to is, if municipalities were run accordingly, we wouldn't have seen the significant pay increases, bonus outpayments for non-performance. We would have seen zero-based budget approaches to ensure that they can fulfill their functions. And lastly, I think the most radical on counter argument to what I'm saying is people are going to say, but what about those who can't afford to pay? And again, that is a subsidization from national government. It's not, legislatively, ratepayers should not cross-subsidize vulnerable communities. Vulnerable communities need to receive their investment from National Treasury and proper planning and grant funding that can support that. So if you have that kind of radical approach, I do believe that municipalities can become even cheaper, more efficient, and safer to stay in. And I think that's where economic stimulation will take place and communities can thrive. So that's basically it. And just on what Prof. Gomede also said, legislatively, there's not sufficient accountability in our municipalities from an official's point of view, because the very political leadership, mayor appoints that municipal manager, the mayor assigns the performance scorecard, which is not the performance, let's say, evaluation, or rather progress is not open to the public. I think it needs to be transparent. People need to see how the council or the officials that they have appointed perform. And there needs to be consequence management for weak performance. And I think that's one of the biggest issues we see, is that mayors appoint people that they believe will toe the line. regardless of performance. And if you look at performance agreements, legislation requires it to be aligned with the IDP. But it doesn't really matter because they put those targets in such weak metrics that you won't see progress. You'll only see regress, and people will receive their bonuses because it looks like they're performing well. So I think one has to create the right kind of structures for proper performance review and input. And then lastly, I do like the IDP abilities for communities to have a say in what their needs are. I think communities just need to understand what the boundaries are of those needs, so that it falls within the ambit of a municipality. And the performance agreements need to be very, very well aligned with that to ensure that there's a sustainable financial future for that municipality, and maybe decentralizing some of the operating functions can go a long way to serve communities better.
Yeah, one of the interesting things, Julius, and I think we've had this discussion offline, is about how COGTA has approached us to work on the white paper for local government, and certainly, we're happy to see is that discussion is actually happening on what needs to change, and that there is some kind of outreach that's taking place on that. Julius, I don't know if you want to take just a couple of minutes to talk about the white paper on local government and our involvement and what we're suggesting on some of the points.
No, sure. Thanks for Jonathan. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, the white paper for local government's been, it's a very, I believe, a very good document, and it was interesting because COGTA invited us to participate with them directly on the reform, which is really an honor. Going with other government institutions representing civil society on this matter. And a lot has been achieved. If you think about it, a lot of previously disadvantaged communities now have access to infrastructure, not necessarily sustainably receiving the services that they need to. And I think that's obviously one of the things that we need to look at. But there's a lot of good things that's happened in the past. But so we see a lot of the negativity and unfortunately the regress, and I think that's because of this kind of political sabotage that we've seen. But yeah, some of the elements that we are looking at is to sharpen up basically the skill sets of councillors. How does a councillor qualify to be in that position? What does their background look like? In the city of Joburg, I think I know two or three councillors that can actually read a financial statement, but the rest of them can vote on it, and that's just not right. You cannot have proper governance and oversight on a municipality's performance if these councillors don't understand the basics and have proper influence on that. We also have seen the political will and influence. That is just significant. If you look at officials, there's really a lot of good people in municipalities. Not everyone's bad cadres that's been deployed. There are really good professional people with hearts to serve. And it's even from a political point of view, don't get me wrong, there are good councillors out there. But it needs to be professionalized, and these officials need to be backed by their leadership. Everything starts with leadership, good, credible leadership. And if you look at the city of Johannesburg as an example, again, we're looking at Joburg Water, and a lot of communities in the city of Johannesburg sitting without water. Now, I know a lot of the viewers might say, well, welcome to join the club, because in smaller municipalities, that's become quite a norm, sadly. But Johannesburg Water is receiving only R1 billion of funding, on the operations for this financial year. They need about 2.5 to 3 billion rand, and their revenue in water is about 12 billion rand. So the ring fencing of funds to actually enable these officials to do their jobs, it's so important. And again, that's where the political separation of powers needs to play a big role and take place. I think transparency and accountability is really very important, and it speaks to the performance agreements that we spoke about. We need to see proper consequences. We need to see one or two municipal managers really being held to account for negligence, whether it is because they haven't invested in wastewater infrastructure, or whether they've been meddling in tenders or not taken action against those who have, so that we can start making examples. And I think then you'll start seeing a bit of a ripple effect and a change in our municipalities. And there's a couple of things, I think one of the most important things is that municipalities need to be customer centric. People need to go to a municipality and they need to be treated as customers. I think that's probably one of the biggest issues in our municipalities, and that's lack of customer centricity. And I think that's also one of the biggest frustrations of residents and businesses. And then, look, there's a couple of things that we are engaging on the reform, and hopefully we can represent communities and civil society well. But I think one of the most important things is cost of service, and then obviously financial sustainability and enhancing productivity in municipal staff. We see bloated wage bills. We see increases every year, whether that's unionized or not. And we see bonuses being paid whilst services are deteriorating, and that has to stop. Even just from a cost of service point of view, a municipality's got bargaining power. City of Johannesburg, again, as an example, we did some research in the beginning of the year where we worked out or found that a pothole of a square meter can be fixed at about 350 Rand using laser technology to cut it and heat technology to fix it. So this is high quality maintenance on a road. Yet it cost 1,200 Rand to fix a pothole in the City of Johannesburg's books. So you could have fixed 3 to 4. So I think cost of service is very important. But, Jonathan and the viewers, all these things are legislated. It's required in legislation. And it shows you how far we've gone down the road through political sabotage and things like that. And the real lack is active citizen oversight. And I think that's where it's very important, regardless of legislative changes, reforms, new political leaders taking office, that doesn't matter. For as long as we don't have proper organized communities who are informed, who are represented by people who know what they know, like whether it's civil engineers looking at roads, whether it's financial auditors looking at the municipal finances, doesn't matter who comes into power, we have to have these organized structures, and all of us have to vote, and all of us have to actively participate in the oversight functions and informing the developments and focus of a municipality. And just the last thing, local elections is around the corner. It's in 2026. A municipality works on a 5-year plan. If us as communities don't get our heads together now and start identifying what the issues are, the basic issues to turn things around in our municipalities within the mandate of that municipality, and not only in our own community, we have to go across the railway track. We have to consider other communities as well, so that we have a fair and informed public participation process that can inform that IDP, that integrated development plan. And for folks who don't know it, please go on the can.org.za website and learn more about it. But that's basically the opportunity we have to tell a municipality how to spend our money. And that IDP informs the performance agreements that's attached to the budgets that's allocated, that's reviewed annually. And for the next 5 years, that's the plan that has to be executed by whoever is in power. Thanks.
Yes. Thank you. And we've got so much work ahead of us. I think it's astounding, but it's one of the joys of being the kind of democracy that we're in, and at the stage that we're in democracy now, and the privilege many of us have in being able to be a part of the solution that I don't think many generations really get in kind of the old established democracies of the West, perhaps. And also the kind of the old nations of like East, like China and Russia, although they may lack public participation, their structures are very much entrenched, whereas ours aren't, and they're malleable. We can work with them, and that's a great position to be in. It's a position of hope. I just want to bring in the professor again, and any discussion on democracy in South Africa today would not be complete without mentioning the government of national unity or the governments of provincial unity. And I know, Prof, that you had extensive input with what was known as the Moonshot Pact in the run-up to the elections. But the reality is, municipalities have quite a while now been running sorts of governments of unity, which is really a kind of a nice name for coalition with everyone else, except in this case it seems to be about EFF and MK and national government and provincial governments. So do you think the GNU and the GPUs may still have a positive impact on coalitions at a local government level? It has really been a fraught space for so long, up until now. Thank you.
Yes, unfortunately I have I think there's internet problems, but I think I'm going to respond in a way that I told you asked the question. I think there's a lot of opportunity for the GNU. I mean, the first thing is just on the legislation part of it. For example, enforcing the idea of holding public officials at a local government level to hold them accountable, personally accountable for failures, for corruption, for mismanagement, and for waste. I think that's really is very important. The second one is also for the GNU to push to make it compulsory at local level to have all tenders to public, so it's so it's transparent and it is online, and also to have civil society organizations sitting on these committees that make these decisions as observers. So I think, up to now, the ANC government before it really opposed transparency, making transparency or allowing for transparency at procurement level, at a local level, and even at a national level. So I think there's opportunity now if we can get a GNU to focus, to make that a priority. And the good thing is, I mean, the current local government minister is from the IFP. So hopefully, they may be, it's a different person, it's a new person. And for me, thirdly, is in terms of enforcing if the GNU can make the public service at a local level also more accountable, to make it more customer service orientated, and to link bonuses and increases based on performance, based on two types of performance. One is, in delivery performance. So if a municipality fail, do not pay allow for increases in salaries, and secondly, link performance management to customers, make the citizens do part of the performance management of local municipalities. And I think that can be pushed from the GNU side, and it would be, I mean, if you just these two or three very low-hanging fruit reforms from the GNU can make a massive difference, I think, in the performance at local level of municipalities.
I'm sitting here quietly thinking, and I'm thinking, if I had to set up a department of governance efficiency, as is well been publicized in the States, being called Doge, I would put Prof. Gomede in there, and I would put Julius in that. I'd have you two heading that department. I think you'd be the right guys for it, certainly. But I'm going to bring you back just in, well, I'm first going to, let me start with Julius on this question first, rather. And this is really our, with the 2026 local government elections around the corner, what do you think are going to be the top 3 big issues for the voting public? I'm going to ask this question first to Julius, and then Prof, I'm going to ask you to answer it as well. Thank you.
The 3 biggest issues for the voting public, I think maybe to get past the things of the past and the thinking. And I think, as Prof. Gomede said earlier, start comparing performance, in municipalities. This is not a national government that necessarily just changes policies. This is really where you want proper services that keeps the lights on, electricity, makes it hopefully cheaper, and water quality and flow of water, and even the maintenance of your roads and things. So I think that's quite important. I think it is also to look at the track record a bit further than just the last 3-4 years, to determine, who's got the most sustainable track record, I think, so that they can be better informed as voters. And I think it's just to gear up, with throughout all the political noise. I think the GNU might play a big strategic role in what the structures would look like in the next local elections. If they can get the golden thread down all the way through. But I think what's most important is communities need to get better organized, so that it doesn't matter who gets into power, that they're in a position, and an informed position, to actually influence whoever is in power needs to be doing in the next couple of years. So I think that's very important. So we need to change this voting culture, and I think it's going to be hard and tough, and it's going to be uncomfortable in the next year. But we're also going to hear a lot of political noise, and I think I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot of radical political moves, because there's some smaller parties that are licking their wounds, and I think that they will hope for a comeback in the next local elections. Thanks.
And Prof. Gomede, your 3 big issues for the upcoming 2026 election, what do you think are going to be those issues that people are going to vote on?
I think the exciting thing about the GNU, or rather the last national elections, the 29 May national elections, is that clearly people are beginning to vote based on the present. I mean, I say the beginning to vote. I mean, it's not in all parts of the country, but it's going to be important if we're going to get a quality democracy, that our voting culture change, that people don't vote based on the past, that they don't vote based on ethnicity or based on populist type of promises, and then people begin to vote for people that they may not look like them, but who are competent. So, competence-based voting, that's going to be very, very important if we can get that culture getting root. But it will mean that civil society organizations like OTA and like Democracy Works Foundation, what we need to do is we really need to get the civic education going. I mean, we really need to do that. And of course, also, the IEC has not been visible in that kind of civic education, to explain to people, for people to understand that, when you vote, and also specifically at a local level, vote for people that at least have done something in their life, that, whether you've run a spaza shop, but, a lot of these people who get voted in by people are people who've never done anything in their life, have never managed anything, and so on. And how that is very important. So the voting culture, I want to emphasize, what Julius was saying, is we really have to get that one, we have to get it right. And maybe the last one, can parties at the local level, the parties that are good, the parties that are constitutional, the parties that are competent, can they partner at the local level, going into local elections together to get a competent person there? Maybe parties should begin to think in that way at a local level, also to get the radicals out, the populists out, the ethnic politicians out.
Yeah, I think we've got a very interesting 18 months coming up ahead of us. It's certainly going to be a new phase of our democracy, and an exciting phase. And I agree with you, Prof, that as voters, we are probably starting to adult, coming back to the book that Julius was referring to a bit earlier. So there were obviously quite a few questions posed throughout this. I do think most of them have been answered throughout this discussion. A lot of them are about, how do we hold government leaders to account, reporting lines, and so forth. And on some of them, what we will do is we'll also reach out to you individually from CAN to see if we can assist you any further on some of these issues that have been raised. So without further ado, I'm going to say thank you, everyone, for attending. This has been a really, really great discussion. And it's our final one for the year. We obviously look forward to seeing all our listeners and viewers back next year. We've got an exciting webinar timeline that we're working on for next year. Prof, thank you for availing yourself today. I know you've got an incredibly busy schedule, and I really urge anyone to really go online and Google him and watch his other YouTube interviews that Prof Gomede has given. He gives a huge amount of insight, and they really are worth your time. Julius, thank you once again for being present here and giving your words of wisdom. You've really got a hold on this whole on governance and municipalities and great ideas. So yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you for, it's been a great year, and I really wish you all a wonderful break. For anyone that wants to know more about what we do, please visit www.can.org.za. If you want to know more about what is happening in the city of Johannesburg, we've got a dedicated website and unit. Obviously, we've got Julia here. Julia's a phenomenal individual who really is running on the ground constantly. I know she was at a protest today. She's probably at another one tomorrow. She is the heartbeat of Joburg CAN. And if you want to find out more about what she does, visit www.joburgcan.org.za. So until next time, from myself, Jonathan Erasmus, we wish you a wonderful festive season and good night. Thank you.